Thank you. Thank you very much, Theo. Good afternoon, good evening. It's still morning where I am, so good morning to you all. I'm going to share a screen, which hopefully will work. It looks like it has worked. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be able to talk with you today. Please let me know by waving if you cannot hear me at some point. So for a long time now, I've been fascinated with what I call the scientific fringe, which some people call heterodoxy, and very frequently is labeled pseudoscience. For a number of reasons I will briefly outline, but are dealt with in much more detail in the two books that are pictured here. I find that last word, pseudoscience, extremely unhelpful as an analytic category. As a historian of science, to say one is looking at an example of pseudoscience would imply you had a clear concept on what that category would mean, what was in it and what was not. Yet such a definition has persistently eluded the combined disciplines marked out in the title. Historians, sociologists, philosophers, also the ethnographers aren't quite clear on what that distinction means. Some of you might be itching right now to say, but Karl Popper, and I promise I will get to Karl Popper, but in a little bit. Just because pseudoscience is a faulty analytic category doesn't mean we shouldn't use it or pay attention to it. After all, scientists toss around the word pseudoscientific at various moments, and as an actors category, I think it is not only possible to study this phenomenon, but it's essential. When we look closely at the times various scientific communities deploy the term, we're witnessing boundary construction as it is happening. And this is an incredibly rich moment epistemologically and historically speaking. I worry that I'm getting ahead of myself here, so permit me to back up. My point is that there is a wealth of significant questions that we can pursue by looking at those fields that are located on the fringe, as it were, whether they exist there by choice or whether they were shoved there by the mainstream community. Today's talk is about one of those questions that I think is quite interesting. It's a puzzle I'm still trying to work my way through, so it's not actually in either of these books. It's one that I think requires the cooperation of all the various subdisciplines of science studies to get a handle on. I am necessarily going to approach it as a historian does, because that's how my mind works, but I don't think it can be entirely resolved as a historical question. The puzzle is indicated in the title, Fringe Theories Stack. This is an observation about the fringe, and I will start by explaining what I mean. It will thus take a little while until I get to the argument, but the argument is coming. I'll offer some possible explanations for why these theories stack, and I warn you in advance, I won't be able to explain many features of the phenomenon, which is why I am putting this puzzle out there, hoping that other people can illuminate it or take it up themselves. The story begins when I was researching my 2012 book, The Pseudoscience Wars, which focuses on the cosmic catastrophism of a man named Immanuel Velikovsky. Both because it's helpful to understand the stacking phenomenon and because it's interesting, I'm going to start with a brief description of Velikovsky's hypothesis, which some of you may know. So Velikovsky was born in Vitebsk, which is now in Belarus, but was then part of the Russian Empire. He had a very tumultuous youth and young adulthood, moving from around Russia for a while, then to Germany, France, Scotland, Austria, and eventually he ends up in Tel Aviv in the 1930s, where he manages his parents' real estate investments, but he also trained as a psychiatrist in Vienna. In 1939, he moved with his wife and two daughters to New York City to pursue an idea for a book. The book was intended to be a refutation of Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism, published that same year, 1939. Freud's argument is very complicated and subtle, but suffice it to say that Velikovsky was enraged by it. Specifically by the claim that Freud had that Moses was an Egyptian, not an Israelite, and that the religion that became Judaism emerged out of guilt of the people having murdered Moses. So while working to refute this book at New York Public Library, he found a translated Egyptian papyrus known as the Papyrus Ipuwer, which he believed related an Egyptian account of the 10 plagues from Exodus. Starting from that parallelism of the papyrus and Exodus, he delved into more research and ends up staying in the United States for the rest of his life, and eventually settling down in Princeton across the street from my house. I moved there much later than he was there. And he built up a movement around his ideas, which dissipated very rapidly upon his death in 1979. So what was the idea? Velikovsky was struck by several Exodus stories which look like natural disasters, like the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, which he understood not as a miracle, but a basin draining due to a geological event, the tilting of the Earth's axis. The sun stands still at Gibeon in Joshua, which he attributed also to a shift in the Earth's axis. And this was stimulated for him, all of these natural events, by reading about a theory about Mount Sinai being an active volcano, which got him thinking that maybe these events were all natural. And then he found the papyrus Ipuwer. In order for this text to be a contemporary with when biblical scholars placed Moses, it required some quite significant reperiodization of Egyptian history, basically slicing out 1,500 years and suturing it back together. But he set aside the chronological question for the moment while looking at the physical sciences side of it. He compared it with other myths like Chinese dragons in the sky or Vedic chariots, or the story, this is a local story, I guess, for those in Athens, of Athena popping out of the head of Zeus, and also some ancient astronomy from Mesopotamia. So what could be the event that caused so many disasters that look so similar, at least metaphorically and in language, on a global scale, witnessed by ancient humanity, but was so terrifying that people had to, in a psychoanalytic manner, encode them in literary and mythological texts as symbolic stories? And it had to be a planetary phenomenon, or even bigger than that. He was convinced that the documents show that the solar system had been rearranged in the eyes of humanity. People were alive when this happened. Basically, a comet is shot out of Jupiter, that's Athena, and then heads towards Earth. And it doesn't quite collide with Earth like this, despite the title of his book that we'll talk about in a second. It's more of like an electromagnetic interaction. And for Velikovsky, gravity and electromagnetism are the same thing. And then this comet that is threatening Earth and disrupting the crust and causing all these problems settles down and becomes Venus, our nearest planetary neighbor. It then also displaces Mars, which 50 years later causes other problems. And then we end up with the solar system we have now, but very traumatically for us. That's the story chronicled in this 1950 book, Worlds in Collision. There's a lot of controversy about the publication of this book, which I chronicle in the Pseudoscience Wars, and that's not relevant now. What matters is that he put forth his argument and built up a whole array of other books that argue for his extremely imaginative reorientation of ancient history. These are all, except for Earth in Upheaval, which is geological, the others are all historical. And this produced a plethora of fans, talks and courses on college campuses, heterox journals and conferences, and many other things. This was a coherent account of ancient history and a coherent account of astronomy that was decried as pseudoscience by both scientists and historians as soon as it happened. When I say fringe theory stack, I don't mean this collection of books. This is a coherent part of the same theory. I mean something that happened among Velikovsky's followers. There are two theories that I found repeatedly among his followers in the correspondence, etc., both in the historical documents and when they email me now. There are very few of them still alive, and many of the ones who are still alive no longer believe the theory, but they're still talkative. One of them is a belief that the JFK assassination, John F. Kennedy's assassination, was the result of a conspiracy. This is a European society I'm talking to here. You may not be fully aware of the scale of this particular conspiracy theory, but it is extremely popular among certain sets of people. It's a small group of people, but they're very committed to it. It's not really a scientific theory, although it does involve some theorization about ballistics and how bullets might move. But rather, it's a theory that the assassination in 1963 was not the result of the actions of one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, but as at that point of agreement that it wasn't Oswald alone, there's like a host of different possible explanations and sub-theories, most of which are mutually exclusive of each other. This is a small subculture, but it happens that quite a few cosmic catastrophists adhere to one of these theories. There's no obvious connection between Lee Harvey Oswald and the planet Venus. There's no obvious reason why these two should come together, but they seem to. The second fringe theory that's associated with it is more common, and it's even more intriguing. And that is skepticism that the plays and poems conventionally attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon were in fact written by him. Once again, once you get beyond the skepticism that it wasn't Shakespeare, there's a variety of possible authors, ranging from Christopher Marlowe to Francis Bacon to the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, to William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby. There are over 80 possible candidates. I'm not going to go into the evidence or arguments here about the potential veracity of these claims. Some of you may even believe one of these claims. I'm not casting any judgment about that either. I just want to note that this is a fringe theory in that the mainstream scientific consensus does not think it's true. There are quite a few people who subscribe to variants of these theories, though. It's much more popular than the JFK one. It doesn't mean it's wrong that it's not a consensus, but it's not located at the center of current scholarship. There's nothing in Velikovsky's theory of ancient history in the solar system that requires you to take a position on whether the actor William Shakespeare wrote plays. But yet this seems to track very strongly. Velikovsky even noticed this noticed that many of his acolytes were very enthused by this idea, although he himself didn't take a position. But this story gets stranger. This man is Ignatius Donnelly. As you can tell by the photograph, he has an outsized personality, or did. He was born to an Irish Catholic immigrant family in Philadelphia, and then he received a good education and started out as a lawyer, entering the bar in 1855. He moved to the Minnesota Territory in 1857, fleeing some rumors of a financial scandal in Philadelphia, and he co-founded a utopian community called Nininger City, which is now a ghost town. Minnesota was very good to him. He was lieutenant governor of the state from 1860 to 1863. As a radical Republican, he then served in Congress from 1863 to 1869, and then stayed in the Minnesota legislature off and on until 1898. But it's not his political life that's relevant here. Alongside that career, he also published a number of books that sold very well in his day. In 1882 and 1883, he published Atlantis and Ragnarok. The books present a consistent argument, but the latter one stands out for my purposes. In this book, he reads through mythology, principally the Bible and Scandinavian myth together, and to argue that a comet hit Earth in antiquity. People are able to see the screen, right? The shared screen? Okay, yep. Good. Yep. That a comet hit Earth in antiquity and initiated a number of natural disasters, which were then recorded in myth as well as in geological evidence. This is not quite the same theory as Velikovsky's, but it's really close. It's so close that Velikovsky was accused of plagiarizing Donnelly, that in the 50s when he wrote his books, that he was reading Donnelly's 1880s books. Much like Freud with respect to Nietzsche, Velikovsky claimed that he had never read Donnelly and so couldn't comment on the work, and claims he never did, even after it was pointed out to him. Interestingly, 5 years after he publishes Ragnarok, Donnelly published The Great Cryptogram, which argues that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. Once again, we see cosmic catastrophism and Shakespearean skepticism coming together, in this instance, almost a century apart. These fringe theories stack. They're on top of each other, but there are, of course, many other instances of this phenomenon. Just this June, when Theo invited me to this, there was a lot of discussion about those from the US Air Force and Navy, and a lot of discussion about a lab leak being the cause of COVID-19, the reason why we are not having this meeting in one place. Many of the people who supported one of these, that UFOs are real and covered up by the US government, also believed a lab leak was the origin of COVID-19. There might be some coherence here, as both of them require a cover-up theory by the state, although they're in rather different time periods and they have different purposes. Perhaps even stranger in terms of fringe theories is that the lab leak hypothesis is widely subscribed to by those who believe that the COVID-19 vaccines are either dangerous or useless. If you think a virus was engineered in a lab, that would seem to indicate that a vaccine might be a very good idea to deal with this artificial virus, but that's not what the consistency of the theories and how they work to each other together. Elements of these two theories get wrapped up in larger macro fringe theories, like the QAnon movement in the United States or the Querdenker movement in Germany. The prominence of the Q symbol in both of these is obviously deliberate. So there are 2 points to notice here. The first is, once you believe one fringe theory, it seems much easier to believe several others. I think I can give you an explanation of that, drawing on history, philosophy, and sociology. Second, the stacking of fringe theories does not seem to be entirely random. Sometimes you can see a connection due to ideological affinity, But other times you find patterns like Shakespeare and cosmic catastrophism that it's repeated across 2 centuries, but without an obvious logic. This part I'm not totally able to provide an explanation for, but I'll give you some thoughts. Now to my argument. I told you it was coming about halfway through. This hinges on my schematic model of the fringe. When most people think of science or knowledge, they imagine something like this magenta entity here. It's the set of things that you would find in textbooks or that the vast majority of the relevant scientific community believes. This is the orthodox consensus. Believing all of the stuff in it is not required to be a scientist, but if you don't believe a lot of it or most of it, it's very hard to function as a member of the scientific community. You can be skeptical about some things, but you can't be skeptical about everything or you're not playing the same game. Its border, however, is fuzzy because we don't actually have certainty about our knowledge, and notions are constantly entering the consensus and leaving the consensus all the time. It's historically constituted and fluctuating constantly. And then you have the fringe. It's some distance away from the consensus, and its edges are even blurrier. Although it's even more reductive to think about this in 2 dimensions than my childish drawing here, which is the best I could do, when you could say that heterodoxy increases with distance. The further you are from the consensus, the stranger your theory looks to the people who are in it. There are plenty of ideas that are weird and are not yet consensus, but that live in between. String theory used to live in the in-between zone in the 1970s, and then by the late 80s, early 90s had moved pretty close to orthodox consensus. Where it is now is a matter of significant debate. But it's not all the way on the outer edge. It's not at the very fringe right now, certainly. So what about the edge? The edge is a very heterogeneous place. A lot of theories populate this border, and they're not equally distant from the core. But you do end up getting groupings on the fringe, with some theories being closer together than others. This, again, is a historically mutating arrangement. Creationism and climate change denial now go together, but they didn't necessarily have to, and at various points they didn't. So my questions today are about how we can make sense of this stacking that happens at the fringe, where certain theories begin to cluster, even without any obvious ideological affinity. I'm going to approach this in turn with history, sociology, and philosophy of science, but I'm going to start with philosophy. The typical place to begin with philosophy is with Karl Popper and his theory of falsificationism. There is much more to say about this than I can here, but I expect the account is familiar to many of you. The way you tell if a claim is pseudoscientific rather than scientific is to flip the confirmationist account of logical empiricism on its head. If a theory cannot produce a statement that has the potential to be proven false, then it's unfalsifiable. That means it's not a scientific claim, and if it claims it is one, it's pseudoscientific. The problem with this, of course, is that generations of philosophers have shown that it doesn't work. There's a whole host of other demarcation criteria that have been proposed. None of these are perfect, but they do add significant tools for how we might analyze our specific puzzle. I freely admit I'm not a philosopher, so I'm hesitant to introduce this really crude hypothesis for explaining the first puzzle of stacking. This is not a rigorous articulation, but a suggestion. One thing that seems to me to be going on with individual encounters with a fringe theory, that is a theory that is fairly outside the orthodox consensus zone that is in the center of the model, is that the individual exhibits a strong degree of cognitive resistance to this weird theory that is coming from outside. The new theory contradicts many of the things the individual has been taught, and it's inconsistent with many other things that they believe. There is, so to speak, a high activation energy, as you can see in this basic chemical diagram. So the person chooses to reject creationism or UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever it is. But once, for whatever reason, a fringe theory breaches these cognitive defenses, the first theory can function like an enzyme and lower the activation energy for the next theory to come through. After all, you've already bucked the orthodox consensus once and the heavens didn't cave in, so you can entertain a much broader area of theories. You can also have a Bayesian analysis, which say this is a revision of your priors. I'm less comfortable with Bayes myself. The resistance is just lower the second time, and then perhaps lower still in the future. My suggestion here, therefore, is that rather than trying to focus on the question of demarcation, which is something pseudoscience or isn't it, by instead focusing on explaining empirical regularities like stacking, we might come to a richer cognitive picture of how even logically unrelated theories can function together within an individual's reasoning. The sociology of pseudoscience is a rather different body of literature, and it derives very strongly from the sociology of deviance, especially Robert Merton's strain theory, as well as from ethnomethodology and other anthropological approaches. The work here, unlike the philosophy, is committed to a very strong agnosticism about the truth of the claims being made, and instead focuses on social organizations and how boundaries are constructed between inside and outside. Here, the method is essentially the argument to the puzzle. By starting from a particular fringe group and tracing the shape of the social network, you necessarily come up against strong ties and weak ties, although not everybody uses the language of Mark Granovetter's classic 1973 article, which is up here. Studies that focus on a particular fringe theory tend to focus on strong ties, the affective bonds that keep, say, the Velikovskians or the Querdenker or the creationists close together. But there's an additional angle if you trace out the secondary theories, secondary from the point of view of the scholar studying the group, what secondary theories the individuals adhere to. If you do that, my hypothesis is you will see the strong ties within the group and then weak ties that connect other groups that are strongly bound with each other. If you have some of those crossover figures, they can broker a connection between two separate communities. Someone among the Velikovskians is excited about Shakespeare theories, and the bond that has already built up within the primary group makes it attractive for others to explore the ideas. Because they already have a lower activation energy, this could generate a solution to why the fringe theories stack non-randomly. And finally, there is the history of pseudoscience. This is a very large literature. Despite the fact that working on fringe themes is considered slightly unsavory by many members of the historical discipline. I've had to deal with this for decades now of people telling me it's not worth paying attention to. What's offered here is just a small selection of books, mostly off the top of my head and what had good images online. And these are the books I turn to again and again and again. Just about all of these works treat pseudoscience as an actors category and provide a host of interesting methods about how to access hard to find sources, how to build a non-Whiggish understanding of a fringe doctrine, and also the interconnections among various fringe theories. So there are connections between mesmerism and phrenology, for example, that function as a fairly effective community. And there, it's not quite stacking, it's more a separate community that's created at the same time. So there might be, and this is a very hand-wavy hypothesis, much more path dependence than we suspected, which is what this particular image is supposed to illustrate. It's very hard to find an image that illustrates path dependence. It's quite familiar from the history of technology. Why is the keyboard structured with the QWERTY line at the very top, or if you are in Germany, Qrt Z, and how why the railroad gauge is a certain length in Europe and, well, certain length in Western Europe, and then a very different length in the former Russian Empire, and how those things get fossilized. That is, early technical choices lock into the infrastructure in some way and become extremely hard to change. I don't mean anything quite so strong as that sort of path dependence, because I certainly couldn't prove it. I mean it kind of as a metaphor, but a little stronger than that. If you look ahistorically at fringe theories, it looks like phase one here, where there's just a whole bunch of fringe theories kind of floating around. And there's an infinite choice among the options, and there's no reason why any of them should associate any more strongly with any others. But it's possible that if there are stackings that happen in the past, those can create kind of infrastructural conditions which generate more stacking later. So in our case, while Velikovsky always claimed he didn't read Donnelly, and let's just suppose we believe him, it seems to me totally plausible, and I know it's actually true, that many of his followers might have been curious. And so they read Donnelly, and then they read about the Bacon theory. And then they started researching and they said, well, Bacon is definitely wrong. But most of them are actually Oxfordians. They believe that Edward de Vere wrote Shakespeare's plays. So there is some sort of family resemblance that gets locked in very early on and then gets built up over time. This could also happen if various fringe theories publish in the same set of fringe journals, which will accept heterodox theories. And therefore one can find two theories juxtaposed by the vagaries of publishing choices in the same journal that then become read alongside each other and start to cross-fertilize, or not cross-fertilize, to stack. They don't blend with each other. They just happen to coincide in the same space. So this is a kind of trans-temporal version of the sociological approach. Instead of looking at weak ties and strong ties that happen synchronously, we look at diachronically at the kinds of weak ties that happen through tracing footnotes all the way back. It's not a perfect mapping, but as the De Vere-Bacon problem indicates, but there might be something here. I recognize, though, this is the weakest of the explanations. It's very hard to come up with a historical explanation for why the fringe theories seem to do this. And that's why for this particular question, how to solve those two puzzles, it seems to me essential that the subset fields of the science and technology studies, history, philosophy, sociology, ethnography, anthropology, cooperate and try and figure out different kinds of methods to get at the same question from many, many different angles. Because at certain points, the methods of each individual field might come up a little shy. I tried to be incredibly efficient, and I'm sure I spoke too quickly, but this is where I ended up. I wanted to leave time for questions because I would really like to hear from you. So I want to conclude here and thank you all very much for your attention. I would love to hear your thoughts.